Hello, everyone, and welcome to Beyond Compliance. My name is Jim Albright, and you have come to the right place to hear all about what influences, challenges, impacts, and solutions might be facing process manufacturers today. Now, for those of you who might be new to the series, Beyond Compliance brings together QA, safety, compliance, operations, and business leaders to help teach some new approaches and get you to more consistently and efficiently deliver quality products to your customers. Now, the Beyond Compliance series is brought to you by Safety Chain. They are the developers of a holistic digital plant management platform that is trusted by thousands of process manufacturers to unite plant production and quality teams in order to maximize throughput and yield, ensure quality and compliance, and optimize labor and productivity. Very, very cool stuff. Now, before we get started, just a few housekeeping rules here. We have muted all attendee mics, but please do submit your comments and questions at any point during the presentation because we are leaving room at the end to get those questions answered. Now, we schedule about an hour for the session, but if we happen to run out of time, don't worry. We will absolutely get back to you by the end of the day or possibly tomorrow with your question answered. And yes, this session is being recorded, so please look in your inbox later in the day for this recording. We will send it to you along with the presentation slides. Okay, I'm really excited to introduce today's speaker, Jeff Eisert. He's the CEO of Food Safety Engineers. They're a firm specializing in regulatory compliance, HACCP plans, audits, investigations, training, food allergens, FSMA, and legal representation. Wow, Jeff, that's a lot. Why don't you tell us a little bit more about your background before we get rolling in today's presentation?
All right. Well, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining the webinar. I'm Jeff Eisert. I'm here located in San Diego, California. I have Torrey Pines Golf Course behind me, so enjoy the view. I am a consultant for food safety, kind of up and down the chain. So from legal aspects to retail to the food manufacturers. I'm kind of a unique species in the sense that I've grown out of the health department world. I worked in Orange County Health for 10 years, and now I work at the University of San Diego, overseeing the retail food safety programs. So kind of started up from there, went to Colorado State in the late 90s, got my environmental health degree from there, grew up here in Southern California. I really enjoyed virology and all that. Kind of ironically, that's my CDC sort of exposure, but I found my personality wasn't built for the lab. It's kind of a weird thing. I love the viruses and the science aspect of it, but just not really built for being inside sort of a refrigerated, very white area. And so fast forward, doing the health department thing, learning about sort of applying bacteria science towards the community, worked like in the Little Saigon area, different areas of Southern California, came here to UCSD to run the food safety program. So learning about the regulations, water quality, all the things that really go into it. And then later sort of jumped into doing legal cases for food safety, kind of seeing that element of where the liability's at, things that relate to the health department, but I had a very strong mentor that helped me and kind of brought me through. So he sort of threw me into the pits and said, here come some cases. And it happened to be in the time about 5 or 6 years ago when FSMA was coming out. And I was like, okay, how does this kind of work? How does the whole wholesaling, distribution, FDA, USDA kind of world work? And at that time, it was kind of topsy-turvy. There wasn't a lot of answers to all these elements. And so hence, I really sort of started to fill into that niche of a consultant where I kind of use it like the Shark Tank analogy, where you have someone that's smaller, maybe they come from the restaurant world, and they go into a manufacturing facility, and suddenly they have to have a food safety plan. They have to have binders and documents and HACCP plans. But the world is, they're not really built for that world. And so I kind of blend those two together to kind of help bring them up and say, okay, now you have to formalize your process, get comfortable with the labs. So in the end, I call myself a expert generalist. So I kind of specialize in these elements of getting people through these different portions, all the way through, whether it's the legal aspects of it or even importing. So importing is a whole different world too. It has all different things, and we could have a whole nother webinar just on that because of the different USDA and FDA regulations. So here I am. I wanted to sort of like bring a perspective of HACCP plans, things that we look for. One of the big things I do is prepare owners of these larger businesses for like the NSF, the AIB, the SQF audits. So a lot of them, like in California, they'll be regulated and inspected by the state health department under Title 21 with the FDA. And then suddenly Whole Foods will come to them and say, hey, you have a great product. Your bread is wonderful. Your noodles are great. Can you have an NSF audit for us so that we're assured that what you're producing is safe? And so that suddenly requires these people a lot of times to reach out to me and say, oh my gosh, I need this now and I got to do it. And then I come in and say, okay, let's see what you have and where do we have to upgrade your food safety plan so that you're ready for these audits. And so it takes a while. It's not a one-stop shop. It's really, I have to embed myself a bit into these food safety or into the business to see where, hence the pinch points are at, to go, okay, what am I not seeing in this facility? And the more I've done this, the better I can see where they need help and where just the regulations are sort of going to sort of stick at them. So hence I want to sort of bring you a perspective from the field. I see a lot of different businesses, so that's kind of a unique thing I have, whereas a lot of you guys might be located in one facility or multiple facilities, and you know your food safety plan, your supply chain intimately. And so you know down to the nuts and bolts of what you guys do, and you guys are very specialized in that, and that's awesome because you have to control for those things, especially the bigger you are or the more elements you have. I kind of cover the field, so I want to give you kind of perspective in that. So enjoy. I'll leave plenty of time for comments when we get done if you guys have questions, but I just wanted to kind of show you a few things and hopefully maybe a few nuggets of information for you guys. So back to the slides, just a bio on me. There's a little bit of my history. Let's see if this tabs forward. Yeah, I can't go too fast. Okay. So first portion is we're just kind of go through and I'll show you sort of a few photos from the field. So these slides are photo heavy, just to kind of give you a context. So food bank in New York, you know, they, as an example, food banks have a whole nother element to themselves with donations, with supply chains, with liability. They're much different than an element where they manufacture in one facility and out it goes. They're taking in donations from all over the place. A lot of times it's produce that doesn't have a critical control point to it. It has more of just preventative controls. And so we basically have a look at those elements and we get them to fit into the regulations too. But you see that there's a lot of different businesses and business models that have to fit into this food safety world. So AIB inspected, we have a warehouse in New York City. Food bank, I just use as an example because they're not manufacturing, they're basically moving and donating. And they're basically a distribution warehouse facility. The same thing, photos from the fields. Here's like a manufacturer, you know, they make noodles. These are kind of the things we look for, environmental monitoring programs, HACCP plans, food safety plans. All my clients end up with quite a bit of documents and binders. And so it takes a little bit, but it's definitely par for the course. Let's see what we have. Laboratory support. So one thing I wanted to sort of mention is like, one thing I noticed was how intimate the owners have to be with the laboratories to get what they need to done. So one of the first things I do when I onboard a new client is I get them comfortable with the laboratory. So I know the local laboratories out here, and it's been kind of a back and forth too, because the laboratories kind of live in their lab world. And so when I started doing this, I said, you guys aren't marketing and understanding really how environmental monitoring works. How do you speak to the business owner about environmental monitoring? You can't speak lab, you have to speak, this is what we're gonna do. So like when I first started out, I was like, what does swabbing look like? How do you handle the swabs? What are the chain of custodies that you have to do? Is there a timeline to it? And so, because the way I look at it is as a consultant, I'm gonna come in and work on the food safety plan, but there's gonna be a point where it's the owner running his food safety plan and the laboratory coming in for the routine environmental monitoring, for the recall, all those things. So laboratory support is key and critical because that's the owner, and the owner needs to be able to understand what the lab is saying. And basically to also to ask for what kind of services, what is an aerobic plate count, what is a Collie alert, how much do each one of these swabs cost. Also one thing I do as a trick is I bring in the lab for the first environmental monitoring sampling elements. And that kind of helps the owner understand, oh, this is serious, because a lab will show up with a white lab coat and they do all the sampling for our different zones. And then we allow that to occur. That gets on the routine sampling for the environmental monitoring program. And then if the owner wants to do the samples themselves, they understand how to do it. They understand the SOP, they see the map, and they go, okay, we can do this, because they're always looking to save money on costs. They don't want the lab coming all the time. But it's a big element, because when I'm the consultant, they're kind of seeing me as a solution. And I need to say, hey, the lab is part of this triangle. There's you, the lab, and myself. There'll be a point where I remain as your consultant on the back end, but you're going to routinely interact with this lab, either to have them come and do the sampling, or you're going to do it yourself. So you have to have a local lab and be comfortable with it and be able to read the data. They can't just stare at a piece of paper and say, what does this mean, Jeff? So you have to teach them to walk a little bit. So we have laboratory support. So here's the goals for today. So the pinch point topics I wanted to go over was foreign objects, recall, environmental monitoring. So I figure there's a few little caveats in there that might help you guys kind of see where you can save a little bit of money, save a little bit of energy, but still be in compliance. So the first element we wanted to go into is foreign objects. So inside of Title 21 FDA, you have to monitor for foreign objects. And so the question is, well, when do I know that this is really a hazard? And so that's a little bit of industry guidance. What we've found is, if you have your preventative controls in place, like your SOPs for glass breakage, brittle glass, GMPs, if your food product that you guys have, that you guys provide, hasn't had a history of foreign object contamination, then that goes a long way towards you having a proper hazard analysis in your HACCP plan. So, but that is a little bit of an industry understanding. So like a good analogy is, like, I had a client that did a lot of nuts. And so they basically just roasted nuts, bagged them, and sent them off. So we had to look at it and say, okay, either you're going to have a foreign object detection device, per FDA, or you go back to your suppliers and have them provide you with a certificate of authenticity that they're controlling for that hazard. So that's kind of one of the big things. So the little nugget is basically, if you can do it, rather than investing in these big machines, which require uptake, maintenance, and specialized knowledge, it's a lot easier to go to your suppliers and ask them for certificates of authenticity, and they'll provide you most likely with a letter that they're controlling for this hazard. So just inside of this slide, obtain it annually from your supplier. So then they're controlling the hazard that you identified in your HACCP plan. They may provide this service to either customers as a competitive advantage, or it may cost a bit more for that product for you, but then the hazard is controlled at your supplier. So, and then be sure to verify. So long story short, there's industry suppliers out there that might charge a little bit more, but they're controlling for that hazard, and they'll be very happy to provide you with this paperwork. So like a good example, Bob's Red Mill. So I think in their food safety magazine, they just got an award for what they do. And I kind of use them as a great example of like a flour provider. And so that the whole grain flour is ground up at their facility, their production facility. And you say, well, grinding is a hazard. How do I know there's not metal shards inside of my flour that I'm receiving from you guys? They'll be very happy to provide you with a certificate of authenticity. I think they have an ISO specification that they're controlling for that hazard. So you can say, Bob's Red Mill is a little bit more expensive than my other flour providers, but now I can use this supply chain preventative control to control for them. That's a lot cheaper than a metal detector in most cases. There's obviously the metal detector element. So this is basically a supply chain preventative control. So what we do, and this is kind of the element that has been proven to pass the NSF audits, SQSF and AIB. So you have those letters, you receive those letters annually. And then the main thing you have to do too is you still have to still verify that this is true. So here comes the laboratory. So then in your SOP for your supply chain on your suppliers, you say once a year or twice a year, we're going to take a sample of Bob's red mill. We're going to run it to the lab for metal detection. So there you go. So that's sort of the main element, the little nugget that might help in your pinch point. So if you're sitting there with your x-ray machine and it's just not working, a lot of times you can go and address your supply chain preventative control through that. The main thing is you got to do your due diligence, and you can't just rely on that supplier. So he'll start once, but you have to sort of back it up. And the analogy I use is I think a little bit of the Johnson & Johnson's infant formula control element kind of got broke down inside of there, in that they had suppliers, and all of a sudden they weren't checking for a certain element inside of that baby food formula. So they had a supply chain preventative control. They said, here comes our supplier. But in your HACCP plan, you have to identify that as a hazard, and how are you going to control it? Supply chain and verification. So definitely need that lab. So that laboratory is critical, because those are your eyes. They're also your legal defense. So when you look at it, and you can pick it, you can pick, okay, do we need to do this once a year, twice a year? That has sort of a gray area to it. It's not exact, but it kind of comes down to what you're doing, the quantity. You could look at it as how much variability do you have with your supplier? So this kind of gets into the second element, is that when you go to Bob's Red Mill, as a manufacturer, a lot of times you have to go through your distributor, and your distributor will say, well, we can't guarantee you Bob's Red Mill, or you might just order ground flour. So that's where you have to, if you're one of these larger manufacturers, if you do these supply chain preventive controls, you suddenly have to make sure that what you're receiving is Bob's Red Mill with specifications. And so a little bit, you'll see sort of at the bottom is, I think it's on the next one. I'm going to be mindful of time too. So here's our COAs. So this is kind of a good example. Long story short is basically your supply chain delivery people might not quite understand what you're trying to do, because they're going to provide a product to you as a supplier, and you're trying to go to the source. So a lot of times my clients have to go straight to the source and then make sure that what they receive through their distributor is correct. So it's Bob's Red Mill is received. So, and this is kind of a good example of things that we've seen that work. So I had a client that was doing latkes, little potato patties. And so we got from the Easter Day Farms up in Seattle, we got their Primus certificate that they're controlling for foreign debris. They're controlling for rocks, hard elements that are common with like a potato that comes out of the ground. So we looked at it in a HACCP plan and said, well, you have raw potatoes. How do we know there's not rocks and everything else inside of there? So we have this documentation from them, a Primus certificate, a letter from them about their elements, a USDA certification, and then also we'll follow up with once a year to have a portion of that potato looked at by the lab. And then we also can utilize any complaints coming in. So you have your SOP for your complaints that helps sort of verify compliance. So you can kind of look back and say, okay, we've had 3 years of using Easterly. We're doing this as our supply chain preventative control, and we have no complaints, and we use the lab. That is a very valid way in order to control for your foreign objects. It takes a little bit of paperwork, but it's all in your HACCP plan. And then, so let's see, next slide. So this was a good one. This was from our nut supplier. So Trade in Organics, I believe they're providing cashews to my client. So we got a hold of their HACCP plan. We said, okay, when you guys get the cashews out in the field, this is a big facility out in Fresno, California, they're gonna shell those cashews. Well, how do we know that there's not little shell debris inside of this product that we're receiving here at the facility in Los Angeles? So we get a hold of their HACCP plan. It shows here kind of in the middle, there's a control area for foreign objects. And then I just cut this out for you guys. This was the page inside of their HACCP plan that says we're controlling for these foreign objects. We have a critical control point, and we have corrective actions if such circumstance happens. So we look at it, okay, that's good. That sort of is a sound argument towards the foreign objects for the cashews. And then we do this annually. And then so that's it basically for the foreign objects. Hold your questions till the end and we'll get to them. Let me go through the number 2 of the 3 is recall. So recall is a monster. So most people understand the HACCP, but when it comes to my clients and what they're doing, recall is the element that was really put in by FSMA that the industry is still sort of jumping through because it's a lot of data. So to suddenly say, all the stuff that I produce, I need to be able to know where it's going and who's buying it, and I need to be able to get it back. I need to be able to track it by weight, by quantity. And so it is a big challenge. So it definitely is the part where it takes more fine tuning for my clients. So I start with the food safety plan and the lab, and then we start to work and taper in recall, because you'll see it. They'll start with their food safety plan, they'll do their HACCP training with their staff, and then recall really starts to come into play because it is such a high bar that is sort of set. To be able to suddenly know where all your products going out really looks back into the business and what they're doing. And sometimes this requires almost like a person or half a person, an FTE, full-time employee, to handle this recall element. So I wanted to kind of give you a few caveats about it. If you have pains with recall, I understand. And luckily it's, if you have your controls in place, you shouldn't be having recalls a whole lot. But it's definitely something that is still a work in progress, and software like Safety Chain is a great help. So current pinch point is that that this is new for the food industry. FSMA raised the bar, but industry is still challenged with data management and supply chains that are fluid. So the auditors raised the bar to require 2 mock audits annually, one usually involving packaging material and one drill for an off-hour shift, such as an evening shift. And then the idea, if you don't know, is basically 1 up and 1 down. So if you're the manufacturer, you're responsible for understanding your supply chain, and you're responsible for understanding who your downstream buyer is. So, but if you're the manufacturer and your supplier is here, you're not responsible for understanding what happens at the farm. That's 2 steps out. So you have to be able to look back and have notification of who your suppliers are, have lists and understanding of their contacts, and then understand who your buyers are and where your product is going. And so like in the smaller worlds that I see, there's still a lot of people that just sort of leave the food at the back door and people come and pick it up. Amazon is kind of similar, though Amazon will contract with like a bread company, and then that bread company obviously knows that Amazon's the buyer, but then that bread company in LA that distributes all over the place have multiple buyers. So this is just a matter of like them getting it down on paperwork. And so the lowest level is paper and Excel, and you can do a lot with an Excel, but it can easily get overwhelmed. And then there's solutions such as Safety Chain. There's other mid-sized software companies out there that will kind of help with this. Generally, it starts with a production batch. So for you guys probably have this too. One of the big elements is you have a production batch that will create your lot numbers. And so when you come in and bring your product, you basically have to kind of look at what's coming in, the lot numbers that are on those items then go into your production batch. Your production batch then becomes your lot number. Then your lot number gets distributed. That way, if your product is, say, on the shelves of Whole Foods can call and say, hey, we're having a problem with these lot numbers. And so then you need to be able to know where those are, how much quantity went to Whole Foods, and where the rest of that product is at. So did you discard any? Did you rework any? So that's really like an inventory control. And it gets a little bit difficult because you're creating your lot number for those foods. When you receive like a bag of flour, it has its own lot code or barcode, or some industries, the producer hasn't even produced sort of a lot number on it. So you have to create one yourself. Like, okay, this is a receive date, something like that. And so there's still a few in the mid-sized to small areas where the distributors, those items don't have the lot numbers yet because the industry hasn't really caught up yet, but they should. But that's how that kind of works. A funny thing sort of recall is I have sort of a disaster notice that I put on the back of the binder. And it's kind of like a what to do if there's a problem. So it's an emergency recall action. And so I put it on the back of the recall binder. It says, if you're in the news for your food creating people having an illness, you need to recall. If the FDA calls you, you need to do a recall. If customers are calling you because your food is making them sick, you need to do a recall. And so it goes on the back of the binder, sort of like break the glass because this is what you need to do. So, and then worst case scenario down at the bottom is my contact. So not that I'm trying to drum up work, but I'm trying to really try to reiterate that this recall SOP, this policy that you guys have, is critical. It has to be on the front burner. You know, the food safety plan and the HACCP, that can run on automatic if your procedures are the same every day. But you have to be on the watch every day for this recall element. And when it happens, it's going to be, you know, a liability aspect for you. It's going to be a due diligence aspect for you because the standard is high. You have to be able to maintain these recalls. You have to know what to do and how to handle it. So hence a little bit more of a driving it home with the notice on the back. So doesn't happen a whole lot if you have your HACCP plan in place, but the system is set up where you have to understand where your product's going and how to get it back, who to let know. You don't have to, you know, and that's one of the things too, is the execution and the actual performance isn't normally part of an audit. It's just the ability to let people know. That's all you have to do, is you basically notify. You got to let Whole Foods know. You know, whether it gets pulled off the shelves is up to Whole Foods. But in the regards to the legal liabilities and the regulations, it's just notification. You need to be able to receive notification from your suppliers that there's a problem, and then you show that you took action, and then you let your buyers know. That's it. Like whether the product is in or out is a different story. It's really about you sort of tracking your activities to mitigate the problem. Because that's what the FDA is really trying to do, is basically just get the food out of the system as fast as possible. And that's why it's tough if you have paperwork. So just kind of going through the recall. I'm mindful of our time. This was just basically going through, you have a batch number, production number. You know, a recall can happen even if you're doing everything right. So that's sort of a little bit of a mindset, is you can be humming along at your production facility, manufacturing's good, buyers are happy, and then here comes a notice from your supplier. Hey, the rice that we sent you has glass inside of it. And you're like, what? And then so you have to know what they sent you, what questions to ask, and then where did that rice go? Is it in the building? Did we use it for half the product? Where is it? And so one of the things I like to do is make sure that like my suppliers have kind of a picture of each one of the items that are being received if possible. And that helps with the receiving logs coming in. So it kind of goes back then also to your supply chain preventive control. Okay, what does that bag of rice look like? Is it Archer Daniel Midlands? Who is providing that? Because this is what it's going to look like, and where is it at? So that you can send someone in the facility to say, we need to go find these bags of rice with this lot number. And we need to find out from our production logs, did we use any of that rice and what lot numbers were produced from it? So it's not as simple as it seems, but that's basically kind of the eyeballs on looking on it. So you always have to be mindful that you can have your one back create a problem for you. And that's really kind of like the gist of it. If you kind of think about like Whole Foods, you know, or a supermarket, they have all this liability of all these food products that are there. So Kroger doesn't want the liability. And so that's where Kroger's in favor of this recall of asking, like Whole Foods. They're saying, hey, if you want to onboard with us, you have to have like an NSF audit. We need that third-party audit. And it seems simple, but it's a high bar to achieve. But that's where Whole Foods as a corporation says we have to require our suppliers to provide this because of these different elements that are inside of FSMA. So, and lastly, not to forget, your environmental monitoring program can cause a recall. So you'll have your SOP for environmental monitoring. Say your product, you know, is ready to eat and it shows up with listeria. So now you suddenly have this element where the owner has to have his binder ready for recall. Like, okay, we're doing our environmental monitoring. Say they do it once a month or once a quarter. What if it starts coming up back high? What if we have, you know, a high number in zone 2? Okay, what do we do? You know, and then so I was referring back to that SOP. And so The control is basically to have a good SOP and make sure your staff are trained. So when you do your at least every 6 months HACCP training, you're going over this. But that the EMP really requires even more detail to an already detail-filled recall plan. So a lot of pinch points. And lastly, for recall, you're not alone in your challenges in the world of recall. It is a high standard. So if you got it figured out, good. But it is kind of the high bar that takes more input than it does really to run a HACCP plan, because a HACCP plan will kind of run automatically if your production is the same. But recall has elements that you can't control coming at you, and then it has a lot of follow through too. And then lastly, we're going to go through our environmental monitoring programs. So for the environmental monitoring programs, when I started the consulting, it was, well, I understand how this works, but really what creates spikes in listeria, in salmonella? If I walk into a client, I need to be able to tell them whether they're going to pass or not, whether they need to put in a new epoxy floor. Like if their concrete floors and their drains are just shot, and I know that they're going to have harborage, then we need to start discussing that now, because if they have an audit with NSF that they want to have done in 6 months, then we need to start working on that floor now. So this is sort of like some general areas. And long story short, what I found is if you're a relatively clean facility with good sealed or good even unsealed concrete, chances are, and you're sort of an urban environment, you will most likely pass your environmental monitoring programs. You won't have resident salmonella and listeria on your floors, in your drains. I think that has a lot to do with living in sort of a concrete environment where we don't have a lot of dust and dirt in the area. And I've kind of seen that where I've had areas where I've had back parking lots, driveways with a lot of dirt, and of course the environmental monitoring program starts spiking. So once they put in concrete and kind of control that GMP out there, outside the facility, it bodes a lot towards the interior. So having like asphalt concrete right into a concrete facility, nice and clean. And so this is just kind of an example of, you know, I would say 80% of the facilities seem to do pretty well. If you start cutting into the concrete, saw cutting it, creating grooves, then that all starts to create the biofilm that creates the harder areas to clean. But what I found is the majority of places will survive, or they will pass the environmental monitoring program with regular cleaning and good materials. And here's kind of a good example of what won't pass. So sealed epoxy floor over here on the left side, melted from food, basically. I think this was hot sugar reduction that ate off the epoxy floor. So lots of nooks and crannies. The center picture is basically, it's a sealed concrete floor where the vinyl has basically been worn away, and then now you have ground in dirt and multiple surfaces. So if the surface is smooth, a lot of times the easiest solution is first just go to a heavier cleaner. Go to the scrub brushes for the different areas on the floor and see if you can really clean it out, and then put that into your SOP. So I'll start out with basically their SSOP will be normal degreaser to normal cleaner, and then a sanitizer wash. And that a lot of times helps out. And then if they're still not passing in certain zones, then we have to start talking about either patching or working on the concrete. So, but this place obviously did not pass. So they had a lot larger issues. They were basically, the floor was just shot. And so you just can't pass a place like that. So I can open up, Jim, to any comments I want to come through, whether it comes through a chat or whatnot, just kind of let me know.
Sure thing.
Okay.
Thanks, Jeff. I really appreciate it. I personally was taking a ton of notes, learning a lot here. Our first question comes from Claire. It's not actually a question, but it's a go Rams, a fellow CSU graduate.
Oh, thank you. Yes.
Yeah, you got some folks here who
Okay.
understand. All right, good. All right, so going back to your first point here, this is the foreign objects pinch point. There was a question, I guess, really just concerning around the process. If your supplier is controlling hazards,
Mm-hmm.
you should be too, right? I mean, that's part of the whole compliance element. So the question is really just to verify, I think a point you were making around having like an X-ray machine, it's costly, there's maintenance involved,
Mhm.
maybe there's an alternative to having that expense, uh, and that's through getting the certification from your suppliers,
Mhm.
proving that they've gone through XYZ steps to make sure that they meet compliance.
Yeah.
So do you mind touching base and just verifying that yes, there are hazard controls at both obviously the supplier and the manufacturer level?
Yeah, it depends on your product. You can also look at like a trade industry. So you might have an industry like, say, like salmon that has the bones in it. And so if you went to and kind of got into the salmon industry, you would see how they control for these hazards. So maybe if you're a QA person in a certain industry, like I would use seafood as an example, you might not be able to get around having someone deboning the salmon. There's no way, or there's no supplier that can provide that with you. So that goes into your HACCP plan. So it kind of depends on the food that you have, but there's a lot of common foods that are already processed, like ground flour, ground rice, cornstarch, where you can get letters from those suppliers that they've controlled for these hazards. So, and generally it's looked at as if you have a mechanical process like grinding, then the question in your hazard analysis is like, well, how do we know there's not foreign objects from that grinding supplier? They just did it and they're sending it to you. And kind of the same thing on other notes. I have letters from the rice suppliers, like a whole grain rice, and they'll say, you're the buyer of my product. You need to control for Bacillus cereus and Salmonella. And so it's kind of a notice, if you get that from your supplier, those two bacteria better be on your hazard analysis plan, because the supplier is telling you, we don't control for it and we're letting you know. And so that's an interesting thing to see, because I was like, oh, wow, okay. Because you look at it in your hazard analysis and say, what are the bacteria common towards whole grain rice? Well, Archer Daniel Midlands will provide you a list and say, if you guys buy our product, you need to make sure you're at least controlling for these two bacteria, and they have sort of different elements to them. So sorry about that. But yeah, it kind of depends on your product. Maybe you can't get around the X-ray machine or the foreign object detector. Maybe a lot of times it's packaging too. Like you'll see a lot of people with the containers. The containers are suddenly shedding plastic into your food. You'll see
Yeah.
that on the magazines a lot. So that's where it's like you either have to, those ones are hard ones to control, because you might have a perfect food, but now your container is creating these problems.
Mm.
Toxicity, like if it's simply a plastic bag inside of a box, that's where you really have to go to these suppliers. And now you're going to have sort of a kind of a supply chain data intake, where you say, okay, we need to control these because it doesn't seem like much, but as soon as it starts showing up that your packaging is creating these recalls, you have to look back and say, oh, company, okay, now maybe I wasn't asking for that, but maybe I need an ISO certification from you. And there'd be a lot of like, it's kind of that's what happens is like the recalls start to occur, and then the bottle company that actually is controlling for those hazards now suddenly has a market. They say, hey, come to us. We're checking for foreign objects. We have a process where when we make the water bottles, we are ISO certified that there'll be no foreign material less than 0.01 millimeters. And you're like, oh yeah? And you get that ISO certification. And that helps you from having to deal with these recalls. So like if
Okay.
you're a bottle manufacturer, that could be the case, or a food manufacturer for your packaging. But it kind of depends.
Right, that makes sense. So obviously trying to get in touch with all those who supplied, whether it's raw material or the packaging, some kind of proof that they're meeting certain compliance specifications. And
Yeah.
also it's up to you to understand what they should be sending certifications for. And to some degree, folks may not know that there's some contaminants or something going on. And that's why you're suggesting, okay, you should have a regular process to get it tested by an independent lab, somebody that can come in and verify that yes, they are indeed meeting those specifications. And
Yeah.
then you had pointed out before that that kind of can act as a legal defense too, which that makes sense.
Yeah. And so, yep.
So when we're talking about HACCP plans, and sorry, this is kind of this is my own question as I'm learning this stuff going along here with you. How often would you say folks generally review and update their HACCP plans in your experience?
Generally should be at least twice a year,
Yeah.
at the least annually. So twice a year is better, because the FDA won't necessarily specify it, but I go with basically what the auditing companies ask for. And it has to do with also like performance of these things, but twice a year is what you want to do at the least. So you do a HACCP team, you go through your HACCP plan, because also when you go through your HACCP plan and review it, you'll ask these questions like, have we had any recalls? And like someone in the group might say, oh yeah, I was in, distribution and we dealt with 4 of these monster recalls. And then the food safety team says, oh yeah, we never heard about these. And you say, oh yeah, the packaging was all wrong. People were talking about plastic in their foods. So the longer you go, the worse it's going to be. So NSF, SQSI, they want HACCP team meetings at least once or at least twice a year, and then to do your recall drills twice a year. Because then it kind of comes down to drilling it back in your mind. The group will say, okay, but you can also see it as like sort of a liability thing. You would rather do it sooner, because if you're having complaints, what if they start happening 3 months after you did your HACCP team meeting? Now you got 9 months of not knowing about these complaints coming in, and then out goes the product. Say it's your packaging going out, making more people sick, more injuries coming, more lawsuits potentially coming back to you. So twice a year is what you want to do for your HACCP team, because then you can review your complaints, you can review your suppliers, and you can do your recall. So that way you can do your drills. So it allows you to kind of look back. I guess the analogy would be like, you don't want to go too long with your auto maintenance.
Sure.
You want to check up every now and then, or dental exams. You put off the dentist. It's not going to be good if you haven't been there for 10 years. You'd rather go once a year and get the bad news, because it'll prevent the stuff from getting worse. So the FDA kind of says once a year. The auditors say at least twice a year. And I go with twice a year because the group needs to understand and make it routine. So like I'll see it with my clients where they shotgun everything once a year, and that's not really the idea. You're kind of getting everybody to a huddle. You want this plan built into the system, and that takes a while. That takes time, that takes manpower. All employees have to stop to kind of handle this food safety plan, but that's what the government's asking for. They're asking for that higher bar. So
Sure.
that's what you have to do. Okay.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And we're kind of touching into sort of the food safety culture element of it, where everybody's kind of responsible for overall food safety and the quality of the product that goes out to the consumer. And we've had a lot of discussions around that on Beyond Compliance, and just kind of highlighting the fact that there are still breakdowns or silos in all the various departments within a plant. And a lot of it's intentional or unintentional rather, where you just, again, don't know what you don't know. And you might be on the quality side and, everything checks out according to your KPIs and what you're looking at, but maybe, on the operations side, things look a little different. They have their own process, but yes, everybody has to kind of be aligned and on the same page, which kind of leads us over to communication, right? Which is the cornerstone to your recall plan, which is one of your pinch points here. Can you talk about, because you had mentioned the example of how your production batch could become your lot number, but small to mid-sized companies are kind of struggling with the ability to assign lot numbers. Can you delve into that a little bit more?
Yeah, I would agree. So the advantage bigger companies have is the ability for like a bottle to go through a filling line and get stamped with a lot number. It's really hard for these small companies. They almost have to come out with, like the old supermarkets where they would put a piece of tape on there and it said the date. Like that kind of strategy has to work sometimes, where it's tough because like that's where once you get into this production batch, you suddenly have to monitor all the incoming ingredients, not just, hey, we used 6 ounces of soy sauce and 8 ounces of brown sugar. It has to be that lot number or whatever that product has to identify it. And you might have to identify that as an incoming. And And imagine if it's something like, I don't know, we'll have some where they use like some baking soda and they only use a small amount. That baking soda might last a month. And so it has the same lot number on it, but they go through all this flour. So then if that baking soda affects so many production units, if that has a recall, it takes everything out. But that's where you have to then go with the chefs, go with the cooks, go with the people in the line and say, okay, we have to start from when you guys receive this stuff, when you guys make this batch, say of like minestrone soup, we have to create a production log. And then you'll have, and a lot of times you can double things up. You can put temperature monitoring on that production log. You can put our glass brittle policy SOP is when that employee is starting to make that product, he's eyeballing the foods, maybe for foreign objects, he's weighing it out. Or if you had to use like a sieve, you know, say you were actually looking for like refried beans is kind of a good example, or corn maza. Like refried beans almost always come from the field with rocks in them. So you have to soak the beans anyways, but then that's also a process where the rocks come out. And so, but then you can use a sieve to sort of filter out anything that is larger than 0.7 millimeters. So the production log is tough, and that's where the businesses have to kind of like invent a system. There's smaller softwares where you can create batches, like I think Shopify is kind of like that, where you can input what you're going to make, and these smaller software companies have places where you can create lot numbers. You can say, okay, today's batch is going to be today's date. That's the easiest thing to do. That will create today's lot number, which will be 12/7/22, you know, and then without the software. And then you say, okay, what are my incoming products? And that will kind of go into that. And then if you do your distribution sales through that software, then that works. So I hope that kind of covered that, but it's not easy. So it's
Yeah, and again, like we hear the story all the time. When you have to run to the back office, pull out a filing cabinet filled with paperwork, and shuffle through stuff to find out, you know, information about where a product came from, or if an auditor shows up, it becomes a problem. It stalls everything, and you know, it kind of falls back to that communication issue and being able to reliably go get that information as quickly as possible and make sure it's accurate.
yeah.
Yeah, so and when we're talking about recalls, yes, you know, some folks, it's rare. Others, you know, again, depending on environmental conditions, you know, things do happen, and you have to kind of stay alert and attentive to those environmental impacts. Can you give us some, we'll just say like examples based on the clients that you work with on areas that there's breakdowns in the recall plan? Maybe they're not, you know, doing mock recalls to the fullest extent or something, or maybe they don't have a fully baked, that's a, I guess, pun intended, part of their recall plan that hadn't been tested or something like that. What's the breakdowns that you cited?
I think the biggest breakdown is what you see, like what might be happening during the audits, isn't the bigger picture. And so you can have your SOPs and how you do it. You can have your policies for your recall, but then you'll see facilities that understand what they need to do, but then they might have complaints that come in and that back-end communication doesn't happen. So the HACCP coordinator will understand how recall works. The HACCP coordinator will manage the training, but then you'll see where there's complaints that came in and nothing was done about it. And they could have done a recall. And that's where I kind of see the breakdown, is the feedback that comes back to that business. And so that's where I try to get them to tighten up. And that's why sort of this paperwork is kind of critical, because it's a learning process. Like the recall isn't like HACCP where it's set in stone based on your process and it has a flow chart. The recall has a flow chart method, but it can change a lot because of your suppliers. And so there's dynamic elements to your recall plan that can cause problems or make it easier. And so the biggest breakdown is really what's on paper and then what happens in real world circumstances. And so generally it doesn't happen a whole lot. So that risk that's there doesn't play out as a liability, but you could see when it comes to sort of, you know, going from soup to nuts, there's parts, which is basically that portion where the world comes back and gives you feedback on what's happening. That can be a problem, but it doesn't happen too much. But I can see it when I get into the weeds of the recall plan. When you say, okay, do you have any complaints? No. Do you know where complaints would come in? Well, they come into the back office over here, and they just sort of shuttle them and hold on to them. I'm like, well, we're not seeing any of these come into your plan. So then it's stated in the SOP that these reports need to come over here and be reviewed every 6 months. So you'll see that not happening, and that's because it creates more work. We're like, we don't want to hear about it. She's going to deal with it. We're production, they're distribution and sales or business, and we're not going to communicate about that. So occasionally you kind of see that happening. Generally doesn't blow up to a problem, but it is one of those things where it's in the SOP to happen, but it's not happening. So, and that's your feedback. So those are the small chunks of the iceberg under the water that you're not seeing before you hit it.
Man, it's true. It's true.
Small iceberg.
Yeah. Now, in the beginning of your session, you had kind of made a point before we touched on the pinch points that folks really need to understand the reporting that comes back to the lab. Is there any common, we'll just say, misunderstandings that you have found when you're looking at lab reports and folks think that they're okay when actually there's an issue, or maybe it's reverse?
Yeah, very common. So being able to sort of interpret the lab reports takes a bit of a skilled eye, and that's a bit of a problem too. I don't know really how to change it unless the lab somehow came down with like almost like a cover sheet that would say, here's your lab report, everything negative. You know, a lot of times most people can read rather than plate counts, they'll just say positive, negative. So that helps a lot. Once the owner gets used to it, that's kind of the good thing about the environmental monitoring programs is if it's routine, whoever's in charge of the food safety will get used to seeing that specific lab report and say, okay, what am I looking at? Like, okay, what's swab, what's zone 1, what's zone 2? You know, it might just say table. And so that's where you have to go back to your HACCP training and you go through your environmental monitoring SOP and you say, okay, here's what we're doing, here's our zones, and here's examples of the lab reports. So it kind of helps because then when I get my owners started and we're saying, okay, let's do our first round of swabbing, we'll have that SOP map and the lab reports from like that lab. And if they keep using that lab, they'll get used to just that report. Okay, table, legs, floor, floor sink, floor drain. Okay, refer back to map. This should be nice and marked. And that's what I try to do. If you guys haven't done it, relate your lab reports to however they present it towards your environmental monitoring map. So if you call it table 1, it's table 1. It's table 1, zone 1, or you know, legs in zone 2, kind of things like that. That way it's all consistent. And as long as the lab sort of keeps consistent, then the owner should get negative, 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 negative. You know, if he gets a positive zone 4, then he goes back to his SOP and he either calls me or he figures out what he needs to do. So, but yeah, that's really one of those things is the owner that runs in the business world suddenly has to understand how laboratory speak works, how to onboard with a lab. And the labs come from a very lab technical sort of world. So I try to bridge that, but I only have to bridge it per client specific to that lab. So they get happy with that lab and off we go. And I'm like, just stay with them. You'll understand the lab reports. And that's where we get with those labs that specialize like in food safety. You know, there's other labs that specialize like in groundwater or stormwater, and they're more chemical. We have some in San Diego that are purely pharmaceutical, but it's the same thing, but we need those labs to be in place. So that's kind of that critical triangle.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, it's almost like speaking a different language. You have different labs that kind of have their own standardization of forms and reports, and each lab could be different, showing different information, but it's kind of showing the same results, right? But just shared differently. Yeah.
And that's kind of you know, just as a tangent, that's like a bigger picture is like, you know, what I explain to my clients is that the FDA isn't coming in and inspecting anymore. Under FSMA, the FDA is out in the field just sampling your product and they'll just send you a notice that, hey, you're high in listeria, you need to recall your product. So the FDA is using the lab as their eyeballs, as their quantitative element to see the quality of your food. So you have to use the labs for your defense. You have to understand the labs, because no different than back in the day when they would come in and probe temp your food, you would have a probe temp thermometer too. You understood that. Now they're just going out in the field, loading docks, warehouses, and they're sampling for the foods or in the stores. So you have to be able to say, okay, let's get it back and utilize that lab for the services you need to see your compliance stuff.
Right. Right.
Okay.
Packaged along with those certifications that you're getting from your suppliers, and again, having those plans that you can show regulators and auditors that, you know, kind of make them feel good. You're low risk. You're in good shape.
Yeah.
So,
And if you do all
yeah.
those things, you're above the bar. I mean, there's places out there technically that have no permit that aren't doing anything. And so they just sort of set up shop, start doing their stuff, they start distributing. It's kind of, it happens, you know, it's not quite the same in sort of the retail food safety world, where the health departments know if there's a store or a restaurant local where people are walking in. But in the wholesale world, it's just a white box. Like I see that in Southern California and LA. They'll just rent a big building and they'll start making food because they have clients of some sort. And then they just go along with it, and they never reach out to the state, you know, and the state and the FDA aren't walking the streets looking for them. So I occasionally get them, and that's the first thing we do. Is I'm like, oh my gosh, the first thing we do is we have to validate that what they're doing works. So that's kind of like a very timely thing. And I've had them ask that. They're like, well, we're kind of making all this food and we got a bunch of buyers and now we need to do some stuff. I'm like, do you have any lab reports whatsoever? No. So that's the first thing we do, is I let them know you guys are in uncharted territories, and if you make people sick, you're in the liability camp right now. So the first thing you have to do is validate your process to show that there's no salmonella, bacteria, E. coli in your foods. And then we get down to the nitty gritty.
Yep. Yeah, and as you mentioned at the top of the call, it actually becomes a value add. You can use that as a mechanism to get more customers, right?
Yeah, I
We're
mean,
safe.
that's,
We can show proof of that. Yeah, good.
yeah, and that's really
Jeff,
like the benefit of jumping through those NSF audits, is now you open up a world where you can go to like Whole Foods, Costco, and sort of I keep contacts with those companies to understand, because what you'll have is like you'll have an NSF audit and then Whole Foods adds on their criteria. They'll say no high fructose corn syrup, no yellow dye number 7. But once you have that certificate, that's your golden ticket to the higher level. All the other buyers will come towards you.
ooh, that sounds great.
Yep.
All right, Jeff, this is amazing. I heard you say that you could have another webinar with us, so I definitely want to work with you to do that, because this was a great presentation, and I know we had a lot of folks who joined, a lot of folks who registered, but we are out of time. So we're going to close it down for now. And obviously, again, thank you for this information. You saw Jeff's email address up there, jeff@foodsafetyengineers.com. You can definitely reach out to him for some additional questions. Safety chain, we have a ton of resources, whether they are e-guides or webinar replays. We're just filled with information. You can check it out at safetychain.com. I want to thank everybody for joining us today. This has been fun. Jeff, please do come back. I'm excited, man. I'm learning so much from you. So this is fun. So everybody have a great rest of your day. We'll look forward to seeing you next time on Beyond Compliance.
Okay, thank you. See you guys. All right, bye.
See ya.